Welcome to Product Marketing Alliance. We're home to everything a product marketer needs to learn, share, and succeed in their role. The definitive product marketing course, Product Marketing Core, is the perfect platform for experienced product marketers to broaden their existing knowledge, as well as educate newcomers beginning with their product marketing journey. Our community. We're home to more than 10,000 product marketers across the world, and every single day, tons of product marketing specific conversations go down. The community hasn't just been an absolute wealth of knowledge and answers, it's the place for constant inspiration. With a PMA membership plan, everything a product marketeer could possibly need is all in there, all in one place. Whether you want to grab a template, learn about how to become more strategic from product marketeers who've mastered it, sit back and watch hundreds of hours of presentations from some of the world's most trusted brands, our packages have got it all and more. We really are, dare we say it, the one-stop shop.
And the topic for today is working remotely. And the reason that we chose working remotely is because, as you can imagine, it's completely topical right now. There's nothing more topical than working remotely with professional people. And there's a lot of pain for a lot of people around the world working remotely who may not be used to it. But there is some expertise on this call where working remotely is standard practice or frequent practice. So it's a great opportunity to bring us all together and to learn. So that said, that's my part really done. I'm going to hand over to Sapphire to start, who's going to help us with some best practice and answer the question, what does good look like?
Thank you, Harvey. Excited to be here with everyone today and hope you had a chance to listen to the podcast. If not, we can talk through a lot of those things. So just a little bit of background on me. My name is Sapphire Reels. I am a senior product marketing manager at a company called Pulsite. The company is actually based and headquartered in Utah, and then I live in LA. So I've actually been remote with this company for 3 years as of last Friday, and then at my previous company, I was remote for about a year as well. So about 4 years total of experience being remote. And there's definitely best practices. And the first thing I would say is there's some pretty bare bones mission critical things that you need to do. But I think the other thing to really keep in mind is every remote work looks different for everyone. And it's really important to just keep that in mind throughout this discussion. Things that have worked for me may not necessarily work for you, but there are a couple of things I think you can do to figure out what works for not only yourself, but your company. And so I'll start pretty high level just in terms of remote working. And then as the discussion goes, feel free to ask myself or any of the other presenters more specific questions around how does this apply to product marketing. One of the first things that I would say around what is best practice is, first of all, being really clear on agreements. My company, we like to talk a lot about the difference between agreements and expectations. And I think when you transition to remote, whether it's really quickly, it's full-time, whatever it is that you're doing, you have to be really open to have conversations around the idea of the way you work. The expectation that you wake up, commute to an office, have your coffee, have your meetings, leave at 5, that no longer applies. And so you can't really make assumptions. You have to make agreements not only across your team, but we're product marketers, we're super cross-functional. So you need to make sure that you're having those types of conversations. Now, generally, a lot of companies that have distributed teams, this is something they'll do up front. I know there's many companies that kind of have their remote manifestos, and so there are companies that kind of have this in their blood, but at the same time, just because your company isn't necessarily remote doesn't mean that you can't work on it, right? So you just have to be open to have these types of conversations. One of the things, a remote company called Zapier, if you've ever heard of them, they do integrations. One of the things they constantly talk about is this idea of defaulting to transparency. And I think that's really, really important when you're talking about these types of agreements. And so you might be thinking hey, what are you actually, what kinds of agreements? And I think there's two really critical places. One is boundaries and one is communication. So when it comes to boundaries, when I say that, I don't just mean at work, I mean personally as well. So of course with your coworkers, you know, you want to ask questions like, what are your preferred meeting times? Like, I'm somebody who I love to wake up super early sometimes and like get in 2 hours of work before anyone's going to bug me. And then maybe I block off my calendar from 9 to 11, right? And take a big lunch. You have to be really clear on those things with your coworkers. And just ask them the question. I think another thing is with family, right? Before we all got on the call today, we were chatting about, you know, a parent or a dog, sorry, a kid or a dog might bust in the room. And so you really need to be able to create verbal cues, right? I've seen so many funny like memes and pictures online of parents putting signs on their office door like, mommy or daddy's in a meeting, don't come in. But if you don't have those types of signs with your family, they don't know that. And I think it's the same thing with your coworkers. Maybe you set a Slack status, maybe you block off your calendar. You have to give them those verbal cues that you would tend to get in an office, but you don't get when you're remote. And one thing I would say about boundaries is just be really flexible that sometimes they're broken, right? Not everyone knows the circumstance you're in. Not everyone understands boundaries. And so you have to be really willing to be a little bit flexible in that. The second thing I mentioned was communication. So pretty much any remote study that you look at, collaboration and communication is one of the top challenges for remote workers. When you can't just run by someone's desk, it has to be really intentional. And so some people like to talk about this idea of over communicating, and I think that's great, but in a workplace, and especially as a product marketer, your job is to disseminate the like most important information to the right people. And so sometimes when people hear over communicate, they say, okay, I give all the information to everyone. And so I look at communication as much more intentional. You need to really think through, what is the best way for me to communicate this? Who needs to know it? Should I use Slack? Should I use email? Should I set up a video call? Does it need an impromptu video call? Should I call them, right? Like there's all these ways that you can communicate with somebody. And so you need to be intentional about that. And that goes back to creating those agreements. So Buffer's another company that has great remote practices, and they actually have a Slack agreement. And they say, this is when you should use Slack, and this is when you shouldn't use Slack. And so I just think it's really important to be intentional about that communication. And then two other quick points, and I'd love to open up to other presenters or any questions, is one, do not sacrifice social and workplace culture. I think we are in a really interesting place where people are forced into this remote lifestyle, and so everyone's just trying to transition and get the business as usual, but you really have to make sure that you're tackling this. The other top challenge for remote workers is loneliness, and you know, I've experienced this in my 4 years of being remote. So you have to be intentional again about setting up time for that bonding, and that can really counteract that. And so it can be really as simple as, hey, everyone's going to have lunch together, right? Like, let's just do that. We have started doing every Friday at 2 or 3 p.m. we do a happy hour, and me and my coworker plan a different game every time. We've played bingo, we've played trivia, like we just get together and have fun. And every single day, every single Friday, we walk away thinking, wow, that was the best part of my week, and I just feel so great. And we feel more connected as a marketing team right now than we ever did before this, and that's really powerful. And then the last thing I would just say around kind of best practice, especially right now, is just have empathy. As product marketers, we are really good at having empathy, and I think we need to make sure that we apply that in the workplace right now, not only for yourself, right? As I mentioned, remote work looks different for everyone. And so for some people, getting up, taking a shower, having a really rigid schedule is great for them remote. Other people, like myself, like that's not what I enjoy. I like remote work because I can do whatever I want on any given day. And so be easy on yourself as you figure this out, and be easy on others as they figure out what works for them. So those are some of the high level tips there. And yeah, I'm not sure who else has thoughts on that, Sean.
Yeah, I want to take a key off the being intentional with your communication, because one of the points I had written down was to actually over communicate. And for me, that's a really important point for me to hone in on, and probably a learning experience as well, because we talked about it in our prep call during the week that I'm bringing a product to market on the 15th of May. But we're also in an amalgamation phase where we're moving 4 companies into one business unit. So our sales team are absolutely overloaded with sales training from 4 different companies, about 3 different product lines from each. So they are being absolutely bombarded right now. So being intentional with how we put this information in front of them, recording sessions, allowing them to send them to them and look at them in their own time, I think is a lot better than this continuous over communication. But the point I was probably trying to get at with that particular area was the kind of organic interactions that you have with your co-workers in an office, with someone in customer success. Maybe you find out that someone's had a really good experience or bad experience. The same with the product management folks, because really you're trying to distill down the best information to bring to the market, and if you don't have that full picture, it's difficult. So you have to make sure you have those regular touch points with those people to make up for those lack of organic intentions and organic interactions that you have with people. The second point I loved that you made was, around being about being honest with your coworkers, having those guidelines, because I would have been used to working maybe one day per week from home, and I think maybe a lot of people might have been in a kind of a similar scenario. Whereas now it's 5 days a week, you're managing kids. And I think being honest with your coworkers and having one colleague who you can really trust to say, you know what, I'm having a shitty day. And I really don't want to have this meeting. Can we push it out till tomorrow? And to be honest, yesterday was one of those days for me, and canceled a couple of meetings, sat outside for an hour during the day, and I actually took today off. So this was actually, when you're in maybe a bunch of maybe 6 or 7 hours of Zoom calls over the course of a full day, keeping that veneer, that utopian kind of smiley face for that time, it can be absolutely exhausting. And just having an ally that you can have to say, you know what, this has been the worst day ever. I'm absolutely up the walls with work. I feel like I'm not really doing anything well. And I think having someone like that can be really important as well. And my last probably point that we talked about in the pre-show was just about taking an actual day off. And like I say, I've taken today off, and maybe if this call happened yesterday, maybe I wouldn't be as happy to be here, but I actually am, because we had that space where it's actually my daughter's birthday, and we had the time just to kind of go for a walk, have a nice meal, and just take that break from work where you're not juggling everything all day. Because we would have, as it was in the plans, was a week off at Easter. And the natural inclination is to, let's hoard my days. And once things the restrictions ease off wherever you're living at the back end of the year, we'll take a chunk of time. But you normally wouldn't get to the back end of April in a year and have taken no annual leave days. It's 4 months end to end in the total year. So take the odd day off, I think, is a massive. Even though you feel like you mightn't be able to do a lot, it's still a real weight off the mind, and really able to kind of shorten that week and give you something to look forward to. So those would be my 3 things, I guess.
I think it's an interesting one as well, and Safa and I were talking about it on the actual podcast about, like, everyone has those days where some days you're just not as productive as you would be, but when you're in office you don't tend to feel as guilty for it. But when you're at home, you have this sense of guilt for it, and, like, I don't know, it just feels so much more heightened. But then I guess it's just a perspective thing. You have to, like, there's nothing to feel bad for. Like, it's human, everyone has it. Like, I've had it a bit today, to be honest with you, but, like, you can't help it, can you? Like, no one can humanly, like, 5 days a week, 9 hours a day, be absolutely on it all the time. And you just
and then the guilts kick in, and you log back on at 9 p.m, work till about 11:30, have a rubbish sleep, wake up the next day wrecked, and the cycle begins again. So I think you're right. But so not giving yourself too much of a hard time, take the odd day off, and have an ally in the office, I think is crucial for me anyway.
Yeah, and I think, Sean, to your point, around the intent. You know, from my point of view, I think that a lot of companies that maybe the membership of the PMA belong to, remote working isn't as alien to them as it might be to other organizations, because the profile of startups is quite high, prevalence of startups is quite high, within the PMA membership. But if you look beyond startups and let's say companies that maybe have only been formed in the past 5 to 10 years, but if you look to companies that have been around for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, actually this is a massive culture shock for them. So we talked about being intentional. Sapphire, you talked, I just wrote this down, about agreements and manifestos and a transparency policy and a Slack policy. And I think that these are all fantastic things. However, I think most companies are a million miles away from that, because speaking from my own experience of working for companies like that, you cannot become a remote worker overnight or have an entire workforce become remote so quickly and expect business as usual, BAU, to continue. But that's what a lot of companies probably do expect. They think, okay, well, we'll move it online and it is what it is and it'll last for however long it lasts. And we'll just try to continue doing the same things in the same way. And okay, maybe a little bit bumpy, but we'll just try. It's never going to work in a million years, because, you know, the key takeaway already on this call is that this is not business as usual. It's a different way of working. And you have to have it either in your DNA or you have to adapt. That's the key takeaway from me. I mean, we talked about, you know, what does good look like? We can talk about what does not so good look like. And, you know, from my point of view, my experience, not so good looks like trying to treat remote working like it's a normal day in the office and do everything the same. But the reality of it is that if you work for a company that's already in the culture, a meeting heavy company, face-to-face heavy company, then this is a huge culture shock and it's a huge challenge, especially if you try to maintain the same rhythm and the same cadence. And somebody, usually up top, has to decide how this is going to work. And there has to be a playbook of some kind. But so I think a lot of companies are still struggling with that. The bigger companies are still struggling with that, especially the older ones. And I think that what's interesting to think about is that when this is all said and done, whatever the new normal looks like, because, you know, from my point of view, it won't go back to exactly the way it was. The world is changing and, you know, we're not in complete control of these things. What do we think the new normal will look like? Do we think, you know, the workforces of the future, which is like now, really, we're living it ourselves, will ultimately work in a different way than they did 4 weeks ago on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, I definitely think so. We do a lot of kind of research on the future of work at my company, because part of our platform, it's a platform to develop tech skills. And so part of that is like, what is the future of the workforce? What trends should we be looking for? So yeah, we've been watching this for a while around the idea of distributed teams. I already see a few really interesting. There's the perception shift, right? We could never be remote. You had IBM, I think it was 2 years ago, say we will no longer do remote work anymore. So I think you're already seeing the perception shift that, hey, we can do this. I think I have multiple friends at companies who they are on the techie side as well, but they've had individual managers who could make the decision if teams could be remote, and they would say no. And a lot of the times that person has never been remote. They've never managed a remote team. The idea of working remote for them is terrible. And so I think coming out of this, you're going to have those people who realize, no, I can still never work remotely and that's not for me. And then you're going to have a lot of folks on my team who said, wow, I love this. This is perfect. This is great for me. And so companies are going to have to start having more open conversations. And I've definitely had a few friends who said, my organization has already said, if I do not want to come back in the office, I don't have to. And so I think for those companies who've already been exploring it, that jump may be really easy. But what it looks like for those big organizations that do not have this in their blood, that will be very, very interesting.
I mean, one of the things that I used to know, just before I hand it over again, was that on the odd occasion before the current situation, is that for companies that work in the old-fashioned way, let's call it, the amount that you actually miss is staggering by going remote, especially when the rest of your team is not remote. So those companies that have those water cooler moments, the coffee room moments, just what your boss wandering up to the corner of your desk going, hey, what about this? It's all gone. And they do it, but they don't not do it. They do it with someone else, and then the information doesn't come back to you. So, you know, the breakdown of communication, from my experience, was quite traumatic, because you'd come back to the office, or you'd come back to whatever normal is for you, and realize that you've not been part of whatever conversation had been. Now, once you're completely remote, you don't know who's having favorable conversations with who on Slack or on video calls. And I mean, it can still perpetuate, right? So should we hand it over? Is it, Sylvia, I think you were going to say something?
Yes. Well, I wanted to say lots of things, but the conversation I've moved on. I work for one of those like face-to-face company.
Yeah.
That is very small and is trying to become remote. So when I came back from maternity leave, actually, so before all of this happened, I had to juggle 2 days remote and 3 days in the office. And I have to say, I love working remote, even if I have a little baby. And that's sometimes a bit challenging. I think one of the big things you need to do to avoid breaking the communication and making sure that you don't become invisible to the rest of the company, because that's such a scary thing, because people forget that you exist, is, and I think, Sapphire, you said in your podcast, that is to be visible and share now, making sure that your contribution is visible to everyone or to the right people. And one thing that I've been doing that I've been working very well is I make my ongoing projects visible to everyone in my company. So everyone knows what I'm working on. And I tend to speak with people remotely, especially when I work from home on a Monday and Friday. So I do all of my catch up and all of my meetings then. So people know that when I'm away, even if I'm having not a very productive day, can have a little chat, we can discuss what we're doing. In this situation, obviously, is different. So I try to block my calendar for like a big chunk of time that I can like work without being disturbed. Because otherwise you spend all of your days on the phone, and I'm not very social generally. So I find it really heavy for me to handle it. And so there is some of the things that you guys have been saying that really like tick some boxes with me, and I really appreciate, Sapphire, the fact that you are able actually to have like social interaction while being away from the office. I think that's absolutely incredible, and I actually want to catch up with you later on to ask you how you do that, because like talking about the weather with your colleagues and playing the game doesn't make you feel you are not doing what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, I definitely, it's been interesting. So I think, Harvey, you had talked a little bit before about there's all these things that these really like, you know, techie, startup-y, culture-y companies, whatever we want to call them, are doing. And that creates this really great environment. And I think for me, like, I'm somebody who, like, I have to trust you to work with you professionally. Like, I want to know who you are. I want to, like, I personally, I really don't like small talk. Like, you'll have those times where somebody wants to set up a meeting with you to give you feedback, and they set up with something, I want to share some context with you is what they'll say. And then they start the meeting, like, so how are you? What are you doing? What was your weekend? And I honestly hate that. And because I'm just the type of person, like, I know you have something to say, so just bring it to the table. And sometimes I think that can be perceived as negative, but like that's because like this is a professional working relationship, and if you have that feedback, you should give it to me. But you have to, like, I've only gotten to that point with people because they trust me and they know me. And so I have I mentioned, like, I'm a very forward person, and I love people to know me. So I think it's just really important to make sure that you understand how you are and how you like to socialize and how others like to, and create time for that. And it might not be at the beginning of a meeting. Somebody might not want to tell you how they are. They might not want to talk about the weather. I have, like I talked about on the podcast, like I have, like Sean said, I have that friend at work every Friday. We have that call and we just chat. So I think it's really, really critical to make that social time and to have that trust, and you can be more open with people. And that, I think the biggest thing is just a license, right? Especially right now, a license to say it's not business as usual. And the level of intimacy that we are getting into people's lives right now is unprecedented. And so just being okay with that and being okay. I think one of the biggest things that my team has taken away, because I'm remote at home, and then we have 2 other workers who are in a Dublin and a Boston office. So we are co-located, but I'm pretty much the only like remote person. The number one thing I say to my team is be okay with it being really awkward. It's going to be super duper awkward, and that's okay. So
I think I'm a bit like you, Sylvia, when the happy hour invitations at 5 p.m. come in for a Friday. It's a bit like, oh, another one of these. Because I actually think it tends to be the format of them is not right or something, you know, where you'll have 40 or 50 people invited and you just see this mass of celebrity squares and the same 2 or 3 people are having the conversation and putting their hand up. So I think, you know, like you say, Sapphire, it's people are still learning as they go. This is a new normal. I think once people kind of get used to it, then we kind of get into the smaller subgroups and the 6 or 7 people in your team that you really want to have a beer with. And the people that if you did go to a pub after work, they were the ones that you'd naturally gravitate towards as part of a night out. I think that's easier, you know, rather than, well, I'm here with my SVP of the entire business unit, some of his direct reports, everybody else on the team, and you don't really want to say the wrong thing in front of 40 or 50 people, especially if the meeting's recorded. So, and you can't take that back. So I think I tend to agree with you, Sylvia. Sometimes by the time 5 o'clock on a Friday evening comes, I'm just dying to put away the laptop. And it can be difficult to kind of G yourself up to get back into that space again, I think.
It can, and I think one of the things we've done well here, and truly this is the first time I feel like in my company where people have been like excited to connect digitally, and I've really been taking advantage of it. I'm somebody like I love hosting and doing that kind of thing. It's just who I am. But one of the things that's worked really well is offering different types of ways to participate socially. So we have that Friday happy hour. As you said, it tends to be the same people, and some people can dominate the conversation. Myself, sorry. So one of the things we started doing is we actually will play games. We'll announce the game before. So if somebody is interested, they could do it. We did trivia last week, and then we use Zoom breakout rooms, and it sends you over to a room of like 10 people. We ask who you want to be with. It's your friends. So that's one type of thing we've done. So people really like trivia. We've done bingo. Another thing that we also do is we started like a fitness challenge, because a lot of people were saying we're not moving. And so we said you can play bingo and you can have your kids play with you, or you can like track your workouts if you're more intense. And that really just comes by like, hey, we're going to try this thing. Does anyone want to do it? And you can be surprised. So I think offering different types of activities is really helpful. And one thing I would just say is, again, I'm the type of person who likes to plan those things, and not everyone does. And there's no pressure to attend. But just as much as we are all feeling the strain of work, typically you have HR, or we call them people teams, who offer these types of events and do things. Right now, they're scrambling just as much to get their feet under them and provide and do their job. And so I would say if you feel like there is that lack of social connection and it is something you enjoy, or you know there's somebody in your office who enjoys planning that, just step up to the plate and say, hey, I want to lead this. So, hey, Sandra.
I felt like I needed to raise my hand because I've been trying to say something for like the longest time, and
please,
I couldn't find the right time to jump in, because every time I wanted to say something, someone else would start talking. So
right in.
I had to do that. So I feel like for me, I'm noticing that I'm overwhelmed when it comes to the opportunities to connect with others, personally and professionally, because now that we're socializing, we're doing this social distancing, It's like the only way that I can connect with friends and family and coworkers is through these conference calls, right? And then on top of that, so that's a challenge in itself, trying to balance that out, because sometimes I just don't want to be on my phone. I don't want to be on my computer. I want to be able to separate myself from that, but that's the only way to connect sometimes. On top of that, I don't know about you all, but I feel like there's this sense of pressure from social media, like, hey, you should be using this time wisely, learn a new skill, launch a new business, um, reach out to your friends or colleagues that you haven't spoken to in a while. And I have been doing the latter and reaching out to folks that I haven't talked to maybe in a few months or even a few years. And that's been great. But again, it's that pressure, like, oh, I should be doing something. Maybe I should work on a business plan. Maybe I should be, because when I come out of this, maybe I should have something ready to go. Even though I'm sort of over that, but still, I feel like there's this pressure to just constantly be doing something. And I feel like the tide is slowly changing, because I'm noticing some people are saying, hey, if you come out of this and you've had a chance to rest, that's great. If you had a chance to, finally get 8 hours of sleep, because most people don't do that, and when they need it, great. And so I'm really just, I don't know how other folks feel about that whole pressure of just constantly trying to connect, not just professionally, but also personally too.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really valid point, Sandra. And I think that the culture of all of these outbound messages that creates this pressure is everywhere, right? I think everybody's suffering from it, from whether it be social clubs or schools or things that you were involved with in your day-to-day life. From our point of view, scouts and sports lessons, and they're all moving online now. To the schools spamming you with today or this week's work for 2 kids or 3 kids, however many you may have if you have kids, and then you've got to juggle your job, and then there's the social pressures around work. There's a lot of outbound communication more than ever now, and I think you're absolutely right, everything that you say, and people are feeling the pressure of it because the amount that you can actually take in is limited, right? And it's brands trying to tell you that, we've got you. Some brand that you haven't heard of from 2 years who all of a sudden really cares about you and they want to be your best friend. We've all had 200 emails like that, right? So,
and they all came in the same week. Did you guys notice that? They came in like in all the same 3-4 days. And you're like, I haven't heard from you, as to your point, Harvey. Yeah. All of a sudden you care.
They must be using the same agency, but they're on a huge retainer, obviously. So there's this whole cultural outbound sort of, pardon the pun, tsunami of information that comes and builds this pressure. And it's natural that most people can't cope with it all. It's because they're trying to deal with the actual reality, the tangibility of the real issues that are in front of them. But like you say, Sandra, I think over time it will change and people will push back and learn to filter. And then companies and organizations will have to adjust themselves. It depends on how long this thing goes on for, right? Because it's over in 2 weeks, which we can hope it will be, but I don't think it will be. But the longer it goes on, the longer the learning curve these organizations have to actually adjust themselves and realize mistakes they may be making. If it's over quicker rather than longer, then people may just revert back to type. So it somewhat depends on how long it goes on for and how much learning is done on their side. If you don't mind, I'd like to just wrap on this topic and actually introduce a new one. Just to wrap on this one, I think that in one of my previous roles, I worked for a digital security company, and we talked about the difference between online and offline, and people's security practices in the online world versus the offline world were completely different. But in reality, both worlds are exactly the same in principle. Your behavior should be the same, whether it's an online world or an offline world. The etiquette is no different. Yet, some of the points that have been made on this group call, companies, organizations, people, employees feel it necessary to overemphasize and overreact or over-communicate under the circumstances. But maybe it's a point that we can make in the wrap-up, that people should behave largely in the way that they would normally use physical etiquette in the real world
Yeah,
online, because it's
I
still
would.
appropriate.
Yeah, I would just add to that quick wrap up to say one of the things that people find difficulty working remote is protection of their own time, right? I end up working all day because I had meetings all day, and then I have to work all night because I didn't get anything done. And I think right now the state that we're in is people's mind goes to, well, I know you're at home not doing anything, right? That's the first thing that goes to their mind. And so be okay with protecting your time still. It is your time, and however you want to use this time is as long as you're staying home and respecting the rules, do what you want and do what makes you happy.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So let's
I'll
switch
add
tracks
to
if we
that.
can. Go ahead, Sandra. Sorry. Go on.
I'll add to that. And I think just to go take that a step further, I think respecting other people's boundaries and their needs, and maybe trying to be cognizant of their needs, because I've noticed even within my organization, there have been a lot of support for those that are parents. Like, hey, you may have 1, 2, 3 children at home, and you're trying to find educational resources, trying to manage your time. So there's a lot of support there, but there's not much of that for those who may not have kids. Like they need support too. And even for myself, I may not have children, but I'm a caregiver to a parent who has a chronic illness, right? So I need support too, but no one's really saying anything about that. So I've had to become my own advocate, saying, hey, I need to block out time to check on my parents, make sure they've taken their medication, they're eating and all of that, and they have the things that they need. But without saying all that, sometimes I'll say, hey, I need to block out time for myself. Sometimes that is immediately looked at as, oh, I'm being selfish. I need time for myself. And it's like, no. Just like you would need time for your children, I need time for my parents, because in some ways I've become the parent. So I need that. And so I think it's important for, I'll just wrap it up by just saying, I think just being mindful of other people when they say, I need that time. It could be they need it for themselves. They need it because they need to check on their children, or they need to check on their parents.
Yeah, Sandra, I love both of your points, because I've never seen so many nodding heads when you were making your point. Everybody on the video camera was like, yeah, I totally feel the same way, because I think it comes back to the importance of messaging as well internally in a company. You're not just positioning supports for people who have kids. You're not just giving people tips for those who are chaining themselves to the desk for 12 or 14 hours a day, because they mightn't, a lot of people, and my wife's company have kind of, they've kind of felt this as well a little bit, where a lot of the tips that they're giving are for people who maybe their wife doesn't work and they already have that kind of support in the home, and it's not really conscious of all scenarios when they're actually providing these tips out there. So I think it's always that danger of, you kind of position your advice to people in your own situation, and you don't put yourself in other people's shoes. I think that's the thing that people have to be really careful of, really cognizant of as well. So
yeah, no, totally agree. So we've spoken a lot about how we may be, what the circumstances may be, the companies that we may work for and their profiles, and how we as employees can manage ourselves and our lives through the current situation. But what can a company do to help you? So if your company doesn't have it in the DNA, they don't have a manifesto, what can a company do to help an employee right now with remote working for, however long it's going to be? Who wants to pick up?
I'll say that. Oh, sorry. Did I interrupt?
No, I was saying Sandra. That's all you.
Okay, I was just going to say, I think it would have been helpful in the beginning if they did this, but hey, better late than never. Maybe do a survey and just say, hey, we just want to talk to you and see what is it that you need, or how are you doing? And then in there, ask, what do you need? Leave it as open-ended questions, because then I think that's where you'll have folks saying, hey, I have 3 children. Hey, I'm caregiving for a parent. Hey, I live alone and I feel scared because I haven't seen another human in 4 days. I think that's where you'll start to see where your needs are. And then from there, you're able to curate programming. You're able to curate services, or some kind of be able to curate the type of needs, or the type of, I can't even talk, but be able to create something to be able to provide that support that your employees need. So I think that would be one way to be able to support the organization.
Bit of primary research.
Yeah.
It's so funny because
I guess it goes to show I'm a marketer. That's where I would think.
There you
go.
I
survey.
mean, yeah, exactly. Yeah, a little survey monkey for everybody. It's funny though, because I haven't received anything like that, and I've received a ton of email and a ton of what can we do to help? And there's all these types of communication out there, but I don't think anybody's really going back to brass tacks and saying, what type of support do you need? Yeah. Everyone's trying to be supportive, but we don't really know how. It's hard to define.
It's not tangible. It's talk, but not tangible.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, my kids' school, I'll give them credit. They did send out a survey the week before the schools closed down here in London, and they really what they really needed to know was how many parents were working, who was essential workers, what the device profile was, who had access to what devices, so that they could measure the kind of lessons that they gave or the materials that they gave and in what format. Because only like 15 or 20% of the parents actually had a printer at home, for example, or the only laptop in the house was dad's laptop from his work. So, and the profiles were so different. And actually, I've come to learn since that actually only 50% of the parents, it's a fairly big school, actually have a dedicated device for the children. So, it's very, very challenging, when the kids are on the Zoom call on mummy's iPhone, and she's trying to grab it back, but I totally agree with you. That's the first place to start, obviously, is insights.
Yeah.
Yes. Sylvia,
Ryan,
you're muted.
got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, from the flip side as well, one thing I've struggled with is maybe what I can do for other people in the company as well. So we recently, I had a new starter join on Monday called Lawrence, who was directly reports to me. So I've obviously been onboarding him remotely, which is a first for me. I've done it in-house. So from my perspective, because he's not next to me, I'm thinking oh God, I've not spoken to him in half an hour. Is he thinking I'm abandoning him? But then on the other hand, I don't want to be messaging him every 30, 60 minutes are you okay? Are you okay? And then again, from his side, because I've kind of tried to make the obvious to him, just come to me whenever you want to. I don't want you to feel like you're pestering me. And he's like, oh, well, I feel like I'm pestering you coming at you all the time because it's over message rather than in person. So that kind of side I've been struggling with this week. And I guess, Sapphire, you probably have more kind of advice on this. I guess you've onboarded people and been onboarded remotely, but how would you manage that side of things? Because I guess I'm just struggling with a balance. I don't want him to feel like he's being neglected, but I also don't want to kind of micromanage and pester myself. And
yeah, I'm happy to answer that. Sylvia, did you have something to add before I answered that?
No.
And it's actually was something similar of Brian, what you were saying. I think when I've been onboarding both remotely and physically. And anyway, whenever you start the first 3 weeks, you all the time feel like you're pestering your boss, or you don't have enough things to do, or maybe you're doing them wrong. You don't get enough feedback and all of that sort of stuff. And I've learned that we need to have, as people that they get onboarded, we need to learn the voice. In this case, if we need something, I need a lot of things. I have kids at home. My husband is not working at the moment, but he cannot be a daddy daycare. So there is lots of things to take care of. And I am very, very, very vocal with everyone in my organization that I speak to about what are the expectation and when certain things are going to land on their desk. And it's important to be respectful of our own time and the time that we want to spend away from the laptop. I cannot spend 10 hours on a call. I have them not physically in a day to do that. So it's not, and I think going back to the onboarding is about communicating, but making sure that at some point during the day, we have a wrap up, just to make sure that everything that has been left unsaid is said in one place and we have this place to circle back.
Yeah, I love that. So I think going back to the top is just listening is really important. Like my company did do a survey. I was actually kind of surprised to see that they did that, but they listened to the survey and they identified like the top 3 needs for remote workers for a lot of people. You would think there was so many things, and a lot of people it's just like, I don't feel like I have the right equipment to be working at home. I don't feel like I understand what's expected of me. So there's a few things there. When it comes to onboarding someone, it is super challenging, right? Because when I was onboarded, I did go into the office and I was there about once a month. Obviously, that's can't happen right now. And so there's a few things I would say. Yes, it definitely can feel like I'm bothering someone. And that's why I think it's important to talk about what types of communication should you be doing. It doesn't have to be like this really masterfully thought out manifesto. It can just be like, hey, if you Slack me a question, like I will try to get to it as soon as I can, but if I don't respond to it right away, like it doesn't mean I'm not paying attention, whatever. Like if you need me immediately, text me. Like just talking about what type of communication they should be using with you is great. You might be like, I'm somebody who like, I love email. Please email me, let me know. So I think that's part of it. One way to get around the pestering is to block out time. And so when I first came on, I would have 1 hour sync with my boss each week. And he was like, this is like so much information and this isn't a good use of time. So we started splitting it and we would do 2 one-on-ones a week, 30 minutes. And I knew I had time. I still do that today. What I really love about that is I know that I have that time blocked out to get questions answered from him. So when you're onboarding someone, it's important to have those touch points, but it's also really important for you to set up those touch points for them. It's not enough to just give them a list of people and say, go meet with these people. Like I know that when as a professional, you should feel comfortable setting up meetings, but as somebody who's new and you're remote, like if you can set up those block time with people, they'll feel better about that. And it can be challenging because of tools like Slack, where it's this really quick synchronous communication. And so you're always expecting an answer. And I think it's just about being transparent and open and saying, just because I'm not responding right away doesn't mean I'm not paying attention. You know, there's other things going on. So that can be helpful of creating those cues. Like even a Slack status can be really helpful. Like there's one that we use at my company. It's like an app you can add. And if you're in a meeting, it automatically changes your Slack status to in a meeting. That one's super great because they know, hey, you're in a meeting. So I think the visual cues for those people are super important. And then giving them a way to ask questions. And so one of the things I do is I have a one-on-one document with my boss, and I put in the agenda for each meeting. I put the couple of key concepts and bullet points we're going to be talking to, and then I like highlight or bold or whatever, and I'm like, I need action from you on these 3 things, because sometimes what can happen is you have this really big you have 30 minutes, an hour for a meeting, and you never know how long the discussion is going to go and what you're going to talk about. So I'm like, I have 10 things to talk about with you and I need action from you on 3. So like, let's start with those. And if we get to the others, that's great. But yeah, I think so. It's creating intentional time and making sure that everyone understands what that time and what those channels should be used for in the onboarding process. And again, going back to my first thing, it's going to be weird. It's going to be awkward, and that's totally okay. That is remote work for you.
Yeah. And it's becoming more common, which by definition means it'll become less awkward because it becomes
exactly
right. I'm conscious of time as well. I've got a couple of things here as I sort of work through the list of questions that we've got, and I thought maybe as we start to sort of draw a conclusion to the meeting, might be worth going round, whoever wants to talk, and share with the group one of your best experiences of remote working. It could be personal or it could be business. It could be something that touched you that you wouldn't have expected. And staying within the HR policy of your own company, what was the worst experience? If you wanted to share, there's no pressure. So Sean, you want to open up?
Probably the best experience, and I'm going to throw in a shameless plug here as well, which is I'm the host of our podcast from Upland Altify. It's called Revenue Optimization Radio, and one of the coolest things I get to do every week is interview a business leader in our space, and that's probably my best remote experience because you do it from home. You have a standing desk / dresser for honesty purposes, and you know I get to kind of interview really cool people. people, most weeks. And yesterday I had Sophie Devonshire. She's the CEO of the Caffeine Partnership, best-selling author. She wrote a book called Superfast, Lead at Speed. But her thing is all talking about pace. And I asked her, what's your kind of 3 key pieces of advice in this scenario, in COVID-19 pandemic world? And her things were energy, empathy, and editing. And I think, editing piece was the one she really honed in on, which is strip back what's not important. Mm-hmm. And that's probably semi-answering your question and a shameless plug, but we're nearly up against the hour, so I wanted to get it in there. But yeah, like recording a podcast from home is definitely my best experience. My worst, probably I wouldn't really have any off the top of my head, to be honest. In an ideal world for me, I do 3 days in the office, 2 days at home. That'd be a really nice split in a utopian world. So ideally, in a couple of months' time, we get back there. So that'd be my closing thoughts anyway. For sure.
Let's hope. Anybody else want to raise a hand? Right.
I can dive in. I guess the best bit for me is, so in terms of how our organisation is structured, I work up north in England, and then the new starter will be working up north with me as well, and the rest of the team is based down south of London. So I'm ish remote anyway. And I think it's been mentioned earlier in terms of you do sometimes miss out on those conversations because the rest of the team are all based in their kind of co-working office, so they'll have all those kind of desktop conversations, or they'll share things together. And I think since obviously now everyone's working remote, I feel a lot more connected to the rest of the company in that now we all operate on Slack. So if there's announcements or there's kind of well done's or there's anything that's being shared, it'll all be done publicly via this general Slack channel. So I think for me personally, it's been quite nice to just feel more involved in all those conversations. Not that I'm intentionally missed out on the other ones, but I think it's just kind of naturally they're all in the room together and they just have them kind of off the cuff. So I think that would be the biggest positive for me. I think the negative for me, quite the opposite to Sean, is the podcasts. And I obviously do a PMA's podcast. I've had to do several in some quite compromising positions. In that, my setup at the minute, I'm in a duplex with my friend and her housemate. So there's 3 of us working at the kitchen table. And the 2 people living with, they're back-to-back calls pretty much all day. So obviously need a quiet space for my podcast. So I literally lie on my belly on the landing. I've been using suitcases as a prop. I've got my mic over here. And then by the time I come to stand up afterwards, because I've been on my belly, I'm all achy and I'm getting too old for this. So that's been my lows. I've enjoyed the podcast, it's just not the position of them.
The mask has slipped.
Yes.
as they say. From my point of view, I think the best experience I've ever had being remote was actually getting a job whilst wearing Hawaiian shorts. That's not bad, is it? Although I was wearing a suit jacket on the top, but I was wearing Hawaiian shorts and flip-flops. And the worst, I think, we mentioned it before, is just those missed conversations. And not being in the communication flow and never really being able to catch up because the train left the station, so to speak, and you weren't on it. And then it might mean that you're not that involved in a project that you should have led, and someone on your team or a different team ends up doing it because it was more convenient to grab them at the time. So for me, that's always been the downside.
Yeah, I would say I have a couple. So the worst is any sort of team offsite where my team is in the office and I am a remote has been pretty terrible. And as I mentioned, we have other co-located in office but remote workers. And I've been very vocal in feedback of I get feedback at the end of the meeting that I looked like I wasn't happy, and I'm not. It's really challenging when you're all in the room having fun playing games and we can't participate, or there's conversation and it's not, they'll go to a coffee shop or somewhere and it's just not conducive. And so that is incredibly challenging. And I think if you're new to remote and you're at a company where things don't work and they're trying to do that business as usual, that is the opportunity to speak up and say, this does not work for me because of this. I really appreciate what Sandra said earlier around being an advocate. And unfortunately, when you do work remotely, you have to be your own advocate. And if that is not the type of person then you are, you gotta talk to somebody, get a mentor who can help you better develop those self-advocacy skills. And then I would say on the flip side, some of the best ones have honestly been recently with these like happy hours and events. It's been such a joy for me to be able to bring my experience and comfort working remotely and bring that comfort to others and give them a spot of joy at the end of the day. But more in my day-to-day life working remotely, honestly, some of my best experiences have been in sales trainings. I have created more people on our global sales team know me than they know the people in our Utah offices. And that's because I'm always reaching out, talking to our global teams, doing those trainings. And so that in my normal day-to-day work, like those remote moments have been incredibly powerful.
Right. Great. Well, I have more questions, but we're going to be here another 45 minutes. So I don't think you'll appreciate it. It's getting late in the UK when you're on European time. So with that said, I think that we can wrap. If anybody wants to give one bullet point of their biggest key takeaway from their first podcast club to close out on, I think that might be a nice way to wrap up. Who wants to start? I'm looking at Sylvia.
I can dive in first if you want. I guess one of my main ones, and I kind of got it from the podcast as well, and obviously Safa and I were talking, it's just like the visual cues kind of side of thing. Like I'm very guilty of when I'm working remotely thinking if I can hear like my Slack go off, I'm like, oh, I must go check that and reply. But you know, and I assume if I'm not replying, people are thinking, oh, she's probably just sat on the couch watching TV, which is obviously not the case. But I think it's just being more intentional, like you say, with those visual clues and not feeling like the pressure to have to always be online and have to always be there. Like it's okay to go off. And, you know, you don't have to reply instantaneously all the time. And it's one of those, like Safa and I were briefly speaking about it before we came on air for this. And it's one of those where it sounds so obvious, but it's just, unless you take yourself back sometimes to actually think about it, it's so easy to fall into the trap of not realizing what you're doing. So that was one of my biggest takeaways.
Right.
I'll say this. I'll say I appreciated the sentiment about communicating as often as necessary. If you feel like you need to over communicate to advocate for yourself, or if you're in the middle of a product launch, like Sean mentioned earlier, then fine, do so. But if you don't need to do it, then don't do it. Just if you need to use your project management tool to communicate updates or ask questions, do so. Send an email, Slack. If you have that quick question, then do so. But I appreciate that because it lessens the pressure on me, and I assume for everyone else, to feel like they need to constantly say something just to show that you're working, when in actuality, you're just draining yourself by doing that.
Yeah, I would encourage everyone to look at a lot of remote performance management, because one of the key things they talk about is you can no longer judge someone's productivity by their responsiveness, because there are days when there have been stretches of time where I haven't talked to anyone on my team for 3 days. That doesn't mean they would never assume I'm not doing my work. So I would encourage those looking at that. Sylvia, what about your takeaways?
So for me, it was great hearing about the empathy. I'm generally very shy, so I tend to live in my own head most of the time. So, for example, what Sandra said about her situation and about the fact that companies needs to survey to understand if they're doing the right things for the customer. I think for the customer, for their employee, and I think that's important. It's something my company is not doing, and that's something that I will take out from this, and I will actually prompt my company to do, because like probably there's going to be so many other people that want to speak their voice and they can't. So that was great for me.
Great.
+1 for me on Sandra's point around being intentional and taking the key off what Sapphire said as well. I love that comment around don't judge people's productivity by their responsiveness. I think that's a 500 retweet line waiting to happen. So get it out there.
Who's going to get there first?
If someone on this call puts it up, they better tag Sapphire.
and that prompted me to think of a former manager of mine who was very, very senior, at his VP level, and I had all my visual cues set, do not disturb, in a meeting, you know, it's this, that, and the other. And I had 4 or 5 different pieces of software all saying the same thing, and it started getting text messages, and then he sent his PA to my desk. It just wouldn't take no for an answer. So I think that actually self-awareness of others for these visual cues and actually what they mean is also really important. And if they don't listen or they don't actually understand what those cues mean, then you have to be intentional and you have to be an advocate for yourself and actually explain to them what it means and that your productivity is not suffering. It's probably because you're being extremely productive and you don't want to be bothered, you know. But no, very good. Okay, well look, I think that we've got some great key takeaways from the time that we spent together over the past hour. So on behalf of myself and everyone, I want to say thank you very much for contributing to this first podcast club. Thank you. And Riley, do you want to wrap up and unhit the record button?
Yeah, I guess just for me as well, I just want to say thanks to you, Harvey, for chairing. I really appreciate that. I've had really good fun. If anyone has any feedback on our affair, obviously this is the first one, hopefully of many. Feel free to just DM me on Slack. I'd love to know what everyone thought about it.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.